Follower of Jesus, even a professional Christian, but you still feel totally messed up inside. If so, you're not alone. There is stuff going on within us that needs to be dealt with. And if we don't address that storm going on inside, well, it's going to catch up with us at some point. And that is a reality for those of us who follow Jesus also. I am so privileged today to bring you a special guest, a repeat guest on our program, Chuck DeGroat. Chuck is a professor of pastoral care and Christian spirituality at Western Theological Seminary in Michigan. He is a faculty member at the Soul Care Institute. You may have heard his name in relation to a previous book that he wrote, When Narcissism Comes to Church. But in this conversation today, I am talking with Chuck about the storm inside each of us and what it looks like to navigate that as a follower of Jesus. This is absolutely not a spiritual bypass, and we'll talk about what that means and what the alternative is, how we can employ the tools God has given us and His love, who God is Himself, in finding the kind of solace and soothing and healing that our souls so deeply need. Chuck has just released a book, Healing What's Within, Coming Home to Yourself and to God When You're Wounded, Weary, and Wandering. Here we go. Well, Chuck DeGroat, I don't have a lot of repeat guests on this program. You are one, and I am so looking forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Well, as soon as I saw your email come through, I thought, well, this is great. And I love being a repeat guest on your program. So thank you.
Yeah, awesome. We are planning to share this right when your new book comes out, Healing What's Within. And maybe just a first question that people may be asking less than they used to at some point, but is still out there. Why do we even deal with this stuff under the surface? You know, the scripture, okay, if you're in Christ, you're a new creature, and you're not supposed to have all these bad feelings,
Yeah.
and everything's just supposed to be okay. You pray more.
Yeah.
Let's just dispense with that right off. Why should we worry about this?
Well, I, I oftentimes with my students, I teach at a seminary, right?
Yep.
I'll get questions like this, and they'll be a bit skeptical about psychology, and they'll assume
Yep.
that you therapists, you're always interested in this introspective work, and it can tend to be so inwardly focused, right? You've
Yep.
heard all these different kinds of things. And this might be a bit of a different answer than you expected, but I often take them back into the early church. And I say, so what does everyone think of St. Augustine, for instance? Everyone raises their hand. We like St. Augustine. And I'll say, do you realize that St. Augustine wrote the very first autobiography in history? He wrote his Confessions, 9 chapters of his own personal story, deep introspection
Yeah.
around his own wounds and addictions. And not only that, we'll go into some of the early church fathers, and I'll talk about some of the early understanding from St. Gregory the Great of the
Mm-hmm.
care of souls, which he
Mm-hmm.
calls the art of arts. And he
Mm.
invites us to do this deep work. I'll talk about Richard Baxter, the 17th century pastor who wrote On the Mischiefs of Self-Ignorance and the Benefits of Self-Acquaintance. And I'll say none of this is new. None of this is as a result of some sort of new age psychology or
Yep.
something like that. This is very old, and it's been around for a long time.
Yeah. Uh, there's so much that we could, go into just with that.
Yeah,
But this book, Healing What's Within, I found it very much from you, from your heart.
yeah,
This must have been a very personal journey for you. And first
yeah,
of all, living the life that brought you to where you can write this, and
yeah,
then, sharing it. It's not about you, but there is so much of you in it.
yeah. Yeah, and that was different for me. I don't always feel comfortable writing autobiographically
Yeah.
myself. In fact, the previous book I'd written on narcissism in the church, I was asked to do more of that, and I said I really don't want to do that. I want this to be, you know, uh, I want this to be accessible to people who are simply trying to understand these dynamics more neutrally,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
I stayed away from that. But as I thought about this particular book, as I was talking to a really wonderful editor who understands the human heart well, and we worked very well together. She said, for you to have some credibility talking about these things, it might be helpful for you to hear about for people to hear about some of your own pain, including landing, as you know, I think you've read it, landing in a hospital in Mexico in April of
Yes.
2012.
Yes.
My body having kept the score
Yep.
after years of neglect. And by the way, that's neglect from someone who took this stuff seriously, someone who is in therapy, but ignoring some of the more somatic or bodily symptoms that had come up for me after a previous challenging experience at a church. And so, yeah, I do reflect on some of that in the book.
Yeah. And I'm so grateful that you do. That just kind of opens the door to one of the questions I wanted to spend a couple minutes talking about. And you were talking about the warning signs in your own body that you
Yeah,
hadn't been paying attention to. One
yeah,
of the concepts that you address is that we all have a dashboard. You referenced the wonderful book that
yeah,
many people know now, The Body Keeps the Score,
yeah,
but the dashboard that we have. Can you kind of
yeah.
describe what you mean by that and why we need to pay attention?
Yeah, part of what I was trying to do is translate some of these newer concepts, particularly when we talk about trauma in the body, into very accessible terms for lay people and for pastors and for people in the church. And when I think about a dashboard, I think about driving down the highway and seeing that dreaded, yellow or red light start flashing, and knowing that there's something going on that I don't understand a whole lot about underneath the hood,
Mhm.
that I need checked. And when I think about the dashboard of our lives or of our souls and bodies, I see five areas: our thoughts, our feelings, our body, our behaviors, and our relationships or our
Okay.
interpersonal engagements. And so when I sit down with people, it's a very handy way to begin to talk about, well, there are a couple of yellow lights here and some red lights here. I've had these intrusive thoughts. I've been somewhat obsessive or judgy lately.
Yeah.
Emotionally, I've been feeling kind of down or sad. My body, I've felt some tension. I haven't been sleeping well, et cetera, et cetera. And with each of those, we can get curious about what might be going on underneath the surface.
Yeah. You referenced trauma there. And yes, that is an understanding we've certainly got more language about today than in the past. But again, certainly not new. Trauma has been happening ever since human
Mhm.
beings fell and sin has been here. Can you talk about that connection and
Yeah.
why even for followers of Jesus, that dashboard becomes a really important thing we've got to take into account?
Yeah. Yeah, well, there again, it's interesting because you'll hear things within this conversation, like where we began, where people will say, well, this trauma language is just psychobabble. It's so new. Everyone thinks they have trauma nowadays. And I would agree that we're probably misusing, sometimes overusing
Yeah.
the language of trauma. For people who do the work that I do, you know this work very well. Many of us think we're underusing the word trauma or the language of trauma because trauma at its core is about disconnection. And when I think about that early story in Scripture, that story of Genesis 3, where that slithering serpent sidles up to Adam and Eve and asks a question that confuses them, gaslights them, really. He's the first abuser in Scripture, makes them call into question God's goodness and their enoughness. What we find is Adam and Eve grasping for the fruit, and then awakened at some level to their own nakedness. They feel exposed and ashamed, and they disconnect. And of course, we next find them hiding and sowing fig leaves, living in a state of disconnection. And God goes looking for them, calling out with a question, "Where are you?" Right? So there's this sense of disconnection that we see right there in Genesis chapter 3 that I call a kind of primal trauma. And all of us live in some sense of disconnection on this side of the new heavens and new earth. I say that there are 1,185 chapters in Scripture sandwiched between Genesis 1 and 2 and Revelation 21 and 22.
Yes.
And
Yes.
we're living those 1,185 chapters. And so my question is, well, how are you experiencing disconnection from yourself, from others, from God? And I think if we're all honest, we could answer that question We can answer that question in a way that might reveal, some basic sense of disconnection from
Yeah.
ourselves, from our spouse, and in some cases, more extreme forms of disconnection that are rooted in trauma.
Yeah. One of the things you talk about is you reference Genesis 3, sin, the fall, that we can easily get into the belief, the mindset that I am my sin, I am
Mhm.
my dysfunction.
Yeah.
And I love the way you differentiate that that is not our identity.
Yeah.
Unpack that for a minute.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I ask people to step back and say, what if we said, I'm not my sin or I'm not my addiction, but I'm struggling with fill in the
Yes.
blank, or I'm
Mhm.
feeling fill in the blank. Let's just get a bit of distance because, at your core, as Henry Nouwen said over and over again, you are the beloved of God. You're an image bearer of God. You're known, you're seen, you're held. But your struggle is, again, fill in the blank. I struggle with too much drinking. I struggle with depression,
Yeah.
whatever the case might be. And I think oftentimes, whether it's sin or, in the psychological world, psychopathology, when we live in that space for too long, we begin to think, well, I am my depression, I am my addiction, this is all I am.
Yeah.
We define ourselves, and theologians have done this, unfortunately, as
Yes.
sinners to the core, as if that's our core identity, as if that identity is deeper still than the image of God within us, right? So I want people to have some sense that no, this is a battle you're fighting. This is a struggle that you're in. This isn't core to who you are. Core to who you are, you're the beloved of God.
Yeah. Yeah. I have just within the last week spoken with a number of people. I was with a group of women over the weekend. I spoke with somebody as we're recording this just 2 days ago on Monday, and feeling like God is against me, that because I have sinned or because I experienced some
Yeah,
brokenness, that that's what God sees when he sees me. And so no way would he want to come close to me or have me come close to him, even if
yeah,
intellectually we as Christians have heard that's not, an intellectual truth. Still our beings kind of
yeah,
believe that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And that's what shame does to us. There's some sense with shame that we're unacceptable to God. We're not worth it, and oftentimes, when I do that work, that too is not core to who we are. That's just a part of us that holds pain. And I want to get curious about those parts of us that feel shame so deeply. We oftentimes there are, things that happen to us, things that experiences with in our early childhood with our parents, with a coach, that we carry into adulthood, that are still there, and people are often surprised that these things show up at 40, 50, 60 years old, right? But these early voices have power in our lives. And so there again, I want to separate a little bit and say, well, let's get curious about that shame that you're carrying within you, that prompts you to think you're not worth it, that God can't possibly look at you or love you.
Yeah. You mentioned trauma already a couple times, and you make a distinction between what happens to us and
Yes.
then what happens within us as a result. That to
Yes.
me was a really powerful idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that too, that's been a hunch of mine for a long time, but you're hearing this more and more from, some of the experts in the field. And it was a number of years ago now that I'd come across a Vancouver physician who's now become a trauma expert named Gabor Mate, who, in the introduction to a book by Peter Levine, said, trauma is not what happens to you, but what happens inside of you in the absence of a compassionate witness. And I
Oh,
thought, well, that's it. There are two things there. Number one, it's not the thing that happened. You may have been hurt or abused in some way. It's
uh-huh,
the
uh-huh.
imprint within you that takes a different shape in each and every one of us. Not none of our stories is the
Yeah,
same, right?
yeah,
You and I could live through a hurricane that swoops through, and our inner experiences might be very, very different.
yeah.
That's the first thing. So I want to get curious about what's happening within you and not generalize to, well, everyone experiences it the same way. That's never the case. But I
Mhm.
think the second piece that's really important is that it happens in the absence of a compassionate
Yeah.
witness, which is to say that we're far stress is far less likely to become trauma if you have someone standing there alongside you
Mhm.
offering care.
Mhm.
And there again, I tell the story in the book of two people who go through a natural disaster, one who holds himself up in a hotel by himself, the other who finds herself in the company of friends who are caring for her.
Yeah.
And the person in the company of friends is far more likely to be resilient in the midst of stress than the person who holds himself up and tries to cope on his own.
I'm sure you are aware of some of the work based on the work that you do about how important human connection is in our
Yeah.
neurobiology.
Yeah.
That, that this interpersonal neurobiology, that something really happens, not just, okay, it feels good, but something
Yeah.
really happens in our brains when we
Yeah.
feel that connection, when somebody else
Yeah.
is with us.
Yeah. Well, our nervous system calms, we feel safe. So, we all have an autonomic nervous system. It's the great equalizer. Can't get out of it. It's just part of who we are. And our nervous systems are constantly neurocepting um, safety or danger. And what we know is that in the presence of a co-regulating other, someone with kind eyes, someone who's willing to be present, our bodies, there's this, I think of it like this. I'll just demonstrate it. Ah, that feels good. I feel
Yes.
better. I feel seen. I feel calm. I'm not as anxious as I was a few minutes ago. I don't sense that I'm in danger like I was. That's the deepest need of the human heart is connection, right? To feel seen, to feel safe in the presence of another, and our nervous systems respond in an extraordinary way to the presence of another who offers that safety and love and sense of
Yeah.
belonging.
Yeah. You also describe God that way as a
Yeah,
compassionate witness, and how important for those who do experience trauma. Spiritual formation is perhaps the key area that you do your work in. And the difference between experiencing God as a compassionate witness versus what we referenced a few minutes ago is somebody
yeah,
who's just looking at the bad parts of you.
yeah.
Yeah, unpack that for a minute.
Yeah, I think I grew up in a church tradition that so emphasized sin, and I don't want to minimize sin, right? But so emphasized it. In fact, started the story of Scripture with Genesis chapter 3 to such an extent that that I began to get the sense that God is just really angry all the time,
Yeah.
And when I went back to that story in Genesis chapter 3 and I heard God asking the question, "Where are you?" I heard it as an angry, "Where are you? Where did you go?"
Yes. Yes.
Who told you that? What have you
Yes.
done? And
Yes.
I think for some of us, given our church backgrounds, our stories, the way we experienced our childhood homes, uh, it's quite likely that we'll have an experience of God like that too.
Mhm.
What I Where I go in the book is to say, God is out on a walk, the walk that He likely would have taken with Adam and Eve every day in the cool of the day when the sun had gone down, when it was cool enough for them to take their walk. And God is looking around saying, "Where are you? I miss you." That first word "where" is the first word of the book of Lamentations. It's a word
Mhm.
of heartbreak. It's heart-wrenching. It's a word that communicates to us that sense of God's deep love for us and the deep sense of loss that even God is experiencing. And
Mhm.
that's a game changer. No longer is God angry coming after you. No, God is heartbroken saying, "Where are you? I miss you. Who told you such a thing?"
Yeah.
Which is to say, um, why would you believe a story like that? The
Yeah.
story that I whispered over you of goodness and flourishing and shalom was such a good story. So I do think that there's a different way of understanding God's presence, God's intention toward us.
Yeah. You write a lot about some of the warning signs on your dashboard that you didn't pay attention to for a time, and how you had to walk through a lot of that. You had been following Jesus for many years. You'd been in ministry
Yeah.
for a number of years
Yes.
when some of this internal storm in you just
Yeah.
broke things out. I
Yeah.
would reflect that there are probably many followers of Jesus
Mhm.
that are in similar in the sense of they've read the Bible, they've prayed, they've gone to church for years, maybe decades, and yet this storm is still going on.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, can you speak to that? Maybe some of what had to turn the corner for you, or how somebody who says, I've done this God thing forever, and it doesn't seem
Yeah.
to be working with what's inside.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do think that sometimes our own worst obstacles when it comes to the healing journey, and I think that was the case for me. I was following Jesus. I was a pastor.
Yes.
I had moved out to San Francisco where I was pastoring. I was leading retreats, 20 and 30 somethings in Silicon Valley, coming on retreat, all going to a retreat center, silence for 48 hours. I was leading people into these spaces, and yet at the same time, what had happened to me, I'd gone through a very challenging church situation a number of years before. I was fired from a position that I really loved and I intended to stay in for a long time. It was deeply painful. It felt profoundly unjust.
Yes.
And I had this sense that no one cared. And so there was that sense inside of me, well, I guess I'm on my own here. And I think that's where it begins. That's that lack of a compassionate witness,
Yes.
that
Yes.
leads stress to become trauma. And in the midst of that, I think there was just this sense that, well, I guess I'm on my own. I've got some good resources. I'll be fine. But there was a lot of simmering anger underneath toward God. There's a lot of shame, self contempt toward myself, right? And so I think a lot of that was sort of simmering within, and it began to boil over to the point that my body, I experienced in my body some significant pain that led me to hospitalization while vacationing in Mexico, a story that I tell in the book. But when I tell it, people are often like, really? That happened in Mexico? And to you, I thought you were a therapist. I thought you knew better.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah,
Um, Angry at God. You
yeah,
used that phrase, you experienced it, and I got to pause there because I think maybe some of the followers of Jesus we're talking to may feel something similar for whatever
yeah,
reason and say, oh, I shouldn't feel that. Therefore, I'll
yeah,
pretend I don't feel
yeah,
that.
yeah.
I know in some of your work with those who have experienced harm in church, undoubtedly express something similar. You said that, and I just got to pause there for a second, give you an opportunity to speak to that.
Yeah, what's interesting is that I'd even done some writing in my first book on lament, on sharing our anger before God. But here again, I had this sense that, the lights had gone out and God had closed the door, and wasn't very interested in my laments. And I didn't quite realize that until a few years later as I reflected back on that season.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you and I both use the language of spiritual bypassing in different circumstances. I mean, I was bypassing my pain to some degree, and so I think in that season, what ended up happening, and I think a lot of people might be able to relate to this. I just got really busy.
Yep.
I got busy in ministry. I became religiously addicted. And
Oh,
it
whoa.
all looked very good, right? Because religious addiction looks great. Well, Chuck is so productive, and look what he's done. And he had that hard experience at that first church, but he's doing so many good things at this next church. And I was getting to do bigger things and speak with some people who had some, credibility and name recognition. I thought, wow, I am about to turn 40, and isn't life grand? And yet at the same time, this simmering trauma within that I was ignoring in the midst of my religious busyness.
Mm. Okay, let's go there. Religious addiction. First, you talk about addictions as our attempt to solve a problem. That may be my phrasing, but that it
Yes.
may not so much be the addiction itself, but we're using them to try to solve a problem. And then religious addiction? Yeah, what about that?
Yeah, so often when we talk about addiction, we see it as the problem, and we want the behavior to go away, and we fail to become curious about what might be happening underneath. And I think at the same time, we fail to be curious about the deeper desire that the addiction is pointing to. There's always something more going on. So, for instance, working with a man who was coping by drinking too much. what we realized was that that was a form of soothing that he learned when he was 15, 16, 17 years old, that was a substitute for the deepest soothing that he needed from his earliest caregivers, his mom and dad, and from ultimately from God.
Yes.
But for him, it had become, as he was isolated and alone, and it became this is a way to feel a little bit better about life and to calm my nervous system. He felt really bad about this. And when he first came to me, he just wanted the behavior to go away.
Yep.
But we had to get curious about what was going on
Yeah.
underneath. And lo and behold, as we did, and as we recognized the bodily implications, the soothing, and how he really longed for a deeper soothing, the behavior began to sort of dissipate. He didn't want it as much anymore,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so but I think it's not just the sex or the gambling or the drinking or the video games or these things that we sort of it's the religious addictions as well. It's our workaholism that looks good to others. How we live in this sort of success-driven Western culture,
Mhm.
how frantic our lives are. Busyness is next to godliness for some, and I think I was living a busy life that was basically religiously addicted. My busyness was keeping me, it was a way of bypassing the real pain, the real wounds.
Yeah. I talk with a lot of people who say something like, just tell me what to do. What Bible verses should I read?
Yes.
Or, what church service should I go to? Or just, how
Yeah.
how can I step up my religious addiction rather than getting to the feeling underneath? How do you help people understand that although certain activities may not be bad, in fact, they can be very good, they can still be an addiction? How do you separate our life with God, which includes things we do, from being addicted to that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we want to get curious about how these things work in a person's life, because it might be that two people are doing the very same things and one is religiously addicted, right? So I want to
Yes.
want to get curious about how that's working, what that's doing in a person, and generally, for those who are more religiously addicted, there's not that level of satisfaction. In fact, in the midst of that work that they're doing for God, there's a lot of disappointment, emptiness, exhaustion. So again, two people doing the very same thing, one experiencing delight
Yes.
and joy, and the other experiencing emptiness and exhaustion. As you probe in a little bit more, as you get curious doing the work that I do, it's interesting to find out how people found their way to that kind of religious addiction, that busyness in the first place. Oftentimes it's, well, that's what I learned growing up. That's what was modeled for me. That's what I saw all around me. Or in our denomination, that's just what we do to prove our worth before God. Whatever the case may be, it serves them in some way. It's some form of coping.
Yep.
And it feels like with addictions, it feels like if I give that up, I'm giving up my very sense of identity.
Hmm. Hmm.
I'm giving up something that I can't live without. That's generally when it's at a level of an addiction. Like, I can't go on without this. If I cut back my volunteer hours from 60 hours a week to 30 hours a week, who will I be? Right?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm wondering too, as you talk about that, if using religious activities, even though they may be very, very good, as a pill to kind of stop my bad feelings, is using it just like you would use alcohol or sex or
Absolutely.
porn or something else. That, to get back to something you were talking about earlier, we have to deal with the storm that's going on inside. We
Yeah.
have to be curious about the underlying things and not use what may be very good things to just
Yeah.
go over the top of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's always interesting to me as I do work with a lot of pastors. It's always interesting to me as I sit with these pastors. We'll be meeting over the course of, I do 5-day, 15-hour intensives, and it may be day two. And they'll say to me, I don't know why I'm here. I don't really experience anxiety like others, but as we get below the waterline, as we get down into that engine, beneath the dashboard lights, as we get down into that engine of the autonomic nervous system, they're in constant storm and constant churn, right? And And when you're in that place where you're in constant churn, there is that sense that I need something to help me feel just a little bit better. And as we get curious about what they're doing to help them feel a little bit better, well, that's where you find the pornography use. That's where you find the alcohol addiction.
Yep.
Um, that's where you find all different kinds of habits that they use to soothe that buzzing anxiety underneath.
Yeah. I do want to not leave people with just, okay, we're messed up. We are. Uh,
Yeah,
but you are very hopeful in
yeah,
sharing practices that can bring us home to ourselves and to God. A couple of those stood out, but let me just start by maybe giving you an opportunity to mention what these practices are, and if you have one or two that you want to highlight.
yeah. Well, I think even before that, I think what's important is the practices for me are anchored in a deep belief in a reality. I think an experienced reality of God within us.
Good.
That God is vulnerable first. That God makes himself vulnerable in Jesus,
Yes.
comes near in ways that, vulnerare is Latin for wounded, right? And so God himself is wounded in Jesus. Jesus's wounds allow for a kind of participation in our lives. Jesus is fully human. And so, and, and I think what's astounding, and I can't get my head around it, is that God chooses to dwell in us, even in the midst of our sin and brokenness and humanness and frailty and fragility. And so part of this is if trauma really is disconnection at some level, and if that's the story of Genesis chapter 3, well, God's heart from the very beginning, even with that first question, is for reconnection, for reunion. And so the practices are practices of reconnection, practices of reunion. And so that might be as simple as a prayer practice that I do using St. Patrick's breastplate. Patrick, and an ancient contemplative who
Yes.
talks about or prays in a way that sees Christ above him and below him, and to the left and to the right and behind and before. I integrate a breath practice into that so that we have this deeply experiential sense that God is above and below and to the left and to the right and even within us. I
Yes.
integrate the breath practice because it's an ancient practice and it involves our bodies. And if disconnection cuts us off from our bodies, and so our breath is a first access point back to our bodies. That's just one particular practice. There are others like it.
Yeah. Love that. Love that. Um, One that particularly intrigued me was saying hello.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
That's something I'm going to remember for myself and for the
yeah,
people I talk with.
yeah,
What do you mean by that? I'll give you
yeah.
opportunity to
Well,
describe that.
yeah, here again, I want these to be very accessible, right? And
Yep.
so the practice of saying hello is the practice of getting curious about whatever we discover within us, those thoughts, those feelings, those bodily sensations that we attempt to cut ourselves off from. Oftentimes these are uncomfortable, and the last thing we want to do is get curious about that neck pain, or get curious about that sadness that we're feeling inside, or get curious about why we're so judgy these days, when we go to church. And and the practice of hello, or peace be with you in the Aramaic, I tell some story behind that, is
Yeah.
the practice of greeting any of these emotions or sensations or thoughts with kindness, with hospitality, with generosity, the kindness that God might offer to you, the kindness that Jesus demonstrates over and over again in the Gospels. Peace be with you. Hello. It's so it's a different way of orienting ourselves. A lot might be going on inside, and we're taught in Western culture to sort of avoid and get busy and spiritually bypass, to simply say, "Oh, hello, neck pain. What are you
Mhm.
trying to tell me about my limits right now? I've been on my computer for 7 hours today, and so I maybe want to get curious about that and practice a bit more compassion."
Yeah. Hello, sadness. Why am I feeling down? Hello,
Yeah,
irritation. What am I not dealing with that,
yes.
is bugging me? Just to all those parts.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I I have come to see that a good way to describe the redemption transformation that Jesus invites us to um, is integration. Jesus
Yes.
was fully integrated as a human being here on earth, and it's not separating these parts off from us, but just like you said, you know,
Yeah.
separation was the work of evil, of the
Yeah.
serpent. And
Yes.
so in the practice of becoming whole,
Yes.
it's like we get to know all those parts, and it's
Yeah.
like God heals them. They don't
Yeah.
stay the same, but they become part, they are part of us.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I wrote a book called Wholeheartedness, and I say that wholeheartedness is the experience of oneness and worthiness in God. Which
Yeah.
is to say, it's not just a concept of, but it's an experience in our
Yes.
beings, in our bodies, and that work of integration. Um, that doesn't just happen with the snap of a finger, as in the work. Um, it can take a lifetime, and I think that that can be discouraging for some. I think sometimes it's discouraging for me. I thought that I might have arrived when I was 40, and then I turned 50, and I realized, well, I really haven't arrived. And so, but as I get older, there's a bit more kindness, even with my impatience. Hello, impatience.
Yes.
What do you have to
Yes.
do,
Yes.
right? So, yeah.
Yeah. I feel like there's a lot more we could talk about, but Chuck, this week when we're releasing this podcast, if you're listening to it or watching when it first comes out, you have this brand new book coming
Yes.
out. Maybe you can just tell us a little bit, tell our listeners a little bit about that, and then how they might connect with you and your work.
Yeah. So it's called Healing What's Within, coming home to yourself and to God when you're wounded, weary, and wandering. And I love that language of homecoming. I think most people will say, "You've read a lot of Henry Nouwen, haven't you?" And I think it's a deep theme in my own body and my own being, this sense of coming home to the one who's already at home within you. And so that's really what the book is about: is God is already at home, whispering, "Come back. Let's
Yes.
get reunited, reconnected."
Yes.
And so yeah, it comes out October 8th. I People can find me at my website, chuckdegroat.net. I'm on social media at Chuck DeGroat in different spaces. I have refused to do TikTok. I probably will never do TikTok, but people can find me in some of those common spaces.
And we'll have links if you're listening in the
Yeah.
show notes, if you're watching under this video. Chuck, I have been blessed by your work, and I know our listeners will be. Many blessings to you. Thank you for this offering, this very personal but very practical also way of just walking the way of Jesus in our very real lives.
Yeah.
It's a gift, a gift.
Well, thank you. You're kind, and thank you for inviting me back.
Well, I pray that this won't be the last time. I feel something very lifted up in my soul when you and I get a chance to connect in a space such as this. So many blessings to you.
Yeah. Thank you.
If you need some healing for what's within you, I know that this conversation was insightful and helpful, and I would invite you to check the links under this video. We have links there to Chuck DeGroat's website and his book, Healing What's Within, and some of his social media and so on. We also have a link there to the previous conversation I had with Chuck on this channel about his book, When Narcissism Comes to Church. I also have a couple other links there about just dealing with the anxiety and fear that you may be feeling, and some of our resources at Dr. Carroll Ministries in relation to that in particular. I also love to hear from you personally. I read every comment here under the videos, and if I can be helpful, I respond. If you want to get in touch with me confidentially, come over to drcarrollministries.com, use the contact page there, and that comes to me directly. And would you subscribe? Just make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you can get this material every time we put something up, generally every week. Thank you again for being here with me on this program, and until next time, may God bless you.